Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to the video. Welcome to my garage. In this video, I'm going to go over the pros and the cons of A-arm or H-arm rear suspension on a Baja compared to the traditional trailing arms. And you know this is going to be a serious vehicles because I've got some RC cars lined up ready to show some of their different suspension, and I've got notes. So starting with the pros of trailing arms, I think one of the nice things about trailing arms is that they're just simpler and they have fewer moving parts. So if you've got a chassis like my chassis where the rear portion of the chassis is straight across, then you don't have to worry about any geometry really, because as the suspension moves, nothing's really going to change. Now it can get a little bit more complex if you're running a chassis where these are angled a little bit, but I think most of them it's just straight across. And even if it is angled a little bit, it's still a relatively simple design. But if it's straight, there's really a lot of things that you don't have to worry about right off the bat. Another really big advantage to the trailing arm is on a trailing arm suspension, the pivot point is in line with the direction of travel, meaning as the vehicle is going forward and the suspension moves, because the suspension is moving this way, the theory is that if you were extended and you hit a bump, you can see how it kind of works with the chassis to go over those bumps. And just the fact that as the suspension moves, it's pivoting with the direction of travel, it makes the impacts much softer on the vehicle itself. Another advantage is that trailing arms usually have a cleaner area down by the transaxle. I'm not going to highlight that yet because I'm going to show that a little bit more on the A-arm. But typically with trailing arms, your area down by where your axle is really clean and wide open. Access is pretty good. Another pro, I guess, I can't prove this one way or the other, but it seems like trailing arm would be stronger. Whether it's because your trailing arm itself is stronger, more so to me, it just seems like it would be stronger because there's fewer moving parts. So if somebody did say to me, which one is stronger, I would probably say trailing arm versus A-arms. Now, one really big advantage to trailing arm suspension is if I take the RC car here and I've got a board clamped down to the workbench here. So what I'm going to do is take the car, hold it up against that board, and then if I cycle the suspension, you'll see that as the suspension travels, there's zero change in track width on trailing arm suspension. So as you're going down the trail or the track, whatever, and you're going through all this suspension movement, your track width never changes. Therefore, your traction should stay pretty good with the trailing arm. Alright, so that's it for the pros. It's a quick list for the pros, but the pros that it has are really good. There's two cons typically that I think of in my head for trailing arm rear suspension. The first one is the fact that as the suspension travels, you can see the little axle in there connected to the transmission over there. And one of the advantages to trailing arm we mentioned was how it pivots in the direction of travel, but that then becomes a con because it's pivoting in the opposite direction of the axle. So the axle is going like this during the suspension movement, but the trailing arm is actually going like this. So what that means is the distance from your hub, which is right here, to the transmission changes drastically as it goes through its travel, because when it's neutral, like right here, the length is one length, but when you start drooping, this becomes farther and further from the transmission. And so your axle is always changing length as it's going up and down. And that's why this vehicle, this radio controlled car, for what it is, for its size, it's supposed to be a monster Beetle, it actually doesn't have much travel. And that's because they didn't really know, they didn't put axles in here that can absorb much distance change. So for this vehicle being what it is, it actually does not have much suspension travel. The other disadvantage for trailing arms is that once you design your trailing arm, that's basically it. You can't really make any adjustments to camber or to towing or anything like that, because once your trailing arm is assembled or fabricated, that's basically it. Now that can also be a pro. So that one itself can go both ways. I myself like to be able to make little tweaks and adjustment. So to me, that's a con, but to other people, that's a pro, because once you fab it and you've got it good, you know, you really might not ever have to change that. So it's nice to know that it's not going to change and need adjustments or keeping an eye on it or anything like that. So some of these pros and cons can go back and forth depending on what your expectations are. All right, now we're going to switch over to A-arm rear suspension. I'm going to start with the pros. The first pro that I touch on here, to me, is the biggest one, and it's, for the most part, the entire reason that I made my Baja's A-arm rear suspension. We just talked about how on trailing arm, the axle travels in a different rotation than the swing arm. Well, on A-arm rear suspension, it's the opposite. An A-arm rear suspension, the suspension pivots are right here, and the axle pivots are on the transmission right up in here. So that means that as the suspension is traveling, the axle is traveling in the same plane. So as this lower control arm makes its arc, and it is an arc, it's actually going out and then in, out and then in. The axle is doing the exact same thing, and you can design it so that their pivot points are right in line with each other. So as the suspension travels, there's no axle length change. There's no plunge. It's easier on your transmission because the axles aren't doing any of this. They're just doing this, and of course they're rotational. And then if you go as far as to get it so that there's literally no plunge whatsoever, then you can use things like non-plunging CV joints, which can go up to like 35, they even say 40 degrees. So you can really get some serious travel, but there's some negatives to that as well, which I'll touch in a minute. Another advantage to the A-arm suspension is because of the way it's designed with an upper link. What are you barking at? You can make camber adjustments, and then depending on how your lower control arms are, sometimes you can make toe-in adjustments as well, which, like I said in the trailing arms, maybe that's not something that you want. So again, this can be a pro or a con. I myself, I do like to be able to tweak and tinker with things like that. So I like the fact that A-arm suspension at least has that to offer. Now this next one, a lot of people probably aren't going to agree with me on this, but once you have your original design of your A-arm suspension, I actually think it's easier to fabricate A-arm rear suspension versus trailing arm. And the only reason I say that is I have built trailing arms in the past, and I've had to make fairly complex jigs to hold the pivot point and then back where you want your hub and all of that. It's always a fairly large task to me, whereas with trailing arms, your jig for your lower control arm isn't that complex and it's pretty easy to weld up. And then for the top, you've usually just got a link. So taking the design out of it, because the design of A-arm is more complex, but once you have the design, I think the actual fabrication is a little bit easier. That one can go both ways now that I'm saying it, but still, once you have to fabricate things like your hub and your lower control arm, because they're smaller, they kind of seem easier. I don't know. Another advantage that A-arm suspension has is you can set it up so that, this car doesn't really do it, but you can have it set up so that as it goes through its travel, you can have the camber change. So you could have it so that at full compression, it leans in the tires, and then maybe at full droop, it also leans them out the same way. Depending on how you lay out your geometry of your pivot points and the upper and lower link and control arms, you can have it make changes depending on where it's at in the travel. Now let's talk about some of the cons for A-arm rear suspension. I think the first one is, I would have to assume, if you look at a trailing arm and an A-arm that are generally built the same, the trailing arm is probably stronger than the A-arm because the A-arms have more moving pieces. They're, the axis that they travel on is kind of opposite direction of the vehicle. I'll go over that more in a minute here. But just the fact that they have a hub and it pivots to the lower control arm, and then there's an upper link that pivots, it seems like there's a lot more parts that can break on A-arm versus trailing arm. Now, one of the disadvantages to A-arm rear suspension is that the track width changes as it goes through its travel. So if I again take this car and bring it all the way up against the wood, so now any track width changes are all going to be exaggerated onto this one tire. But if you notice, as this goes through its travel, well, first thing is you can see that it does actually have some camber change at full compression. You see how that leans in a little bit? But at full droop, when I go down, you see it push out a little bit. And then again, at full compression, it comes in a little bit. Now this car here is specifically meant for racing, and so it doesn't have a lot of travel, and its geometry is really good. Let me show you a more extreme case. Yeah, that car's a lot bigger. This one here is a Traxxas Revo. So if I do the same thing and I hold this tire up against the wood, then if we look at this, this is at full droop. As I come down, and this is just to neutral, there's a humongous track width change. And then again, as you go to full compression, it starts to come in. But right here, from full droop, that's a big track width change. And that's because with A-arm rear suspension, when you're at full droop, your arms start to swing in like this. And the more you droop, the more they swing in. It's the same principle on trailing arms. When you get aggressive with your droop, then you get serious axle length changes. Well, on A-arm rear suspension, when you get aggressive with your droop, you get serious track width changes. So the track width change really is affected by what your intention with the vehicles are. If you take this vehicle, this is meant for competition, so they're not letting the rear suspension droop that much, so the track change isn't too intense. Whereas this car is meant for just bashing around in the backyard. They're not as concerned with the track width change as they're more concerned with giving you as much travel as you can possibly get for bigger bumps or going over curbs, things like that. So this A-arm suspension setup gives up a lot of track width by gaining travel. And I think that's why you'll see A-arms. They're obviously the most popular with vehicles in general, but when you're doing like an on-road car and things that don't have a lot of travel, then the advantages to A-arm suspension are much higher. But when you're doing off-road stuff and you're trying to get a lot of travel, then you really enter that realm of serious track changes. And that's something that you either have to be okay with, or if you're not, you should go to the trailing arm suspension. Personally, myself, I feel like off-road vehicles like this live in almost a constant state of the rear tires spinning, whether it be just from going forward or from just kind of waving around a little bit. So I'm willing to accept quite a bit of track change as my suspension travels, but regardless, if you're thinking about A-arm rear suspension, that is really something that you need to consider. So another disadvantage to A-arm suspension, and I didn't even realize this until I started building it, is that things get congested really quick right around here. With trailing arm suspension, no, I'm sorry, not trailing arm, with A-arm rear suspension, you need to have your connection points, like my pivot bolt down there, really as close as you can possibly get to your CV off of the transaxle. So you're constantly playing this game where you're trying to push everything as tight as you can to the transaxle, so everything gets really crowded and congested down there, as you can see. Then you come up here, because your lower control arm is traveling this way, your shocks now have to go this way. So as you can see, I've got a shock tower here for the coil carrier, another shock tower here for the bypass shock. So all of this stuff is taking place right here, right around the transaxle and right behind the engine. Whereas if this was trailing arm, my trailing arm would just have connection point there and there. Then it would turn and run into the tire here, and then the shock absorbers, the coil carrier, and the bypass shock would come up here. You can see on mine, this is all just open real estate. There's nothing going on here. So I will say it would be nice to have this area dedicated for shocks and then have all of this wide open for much better access. But that's not an option at all with A-arm rear suspension. Then another con or a disadvantage of A-arm rear suspension is that the design itself it's pretty complicated. There's geometry involved as to where all of your connection points are. And like I just showed you, that typically those pivot points and all of that has to take place in congested areas. So the design itself can get pretty tricky, as opposed to if you look at this trailing arm setup, look how simple it is. Look at that. You can see the entire transmission there. It's just got pivots there. On this one, they've got the shock laid down, but you know, otherwise your shock would be going up this way. It's just, there's nothing back there. It's so simple. Compared to, you look at an A-arm, you've got the lower control arm, you've got the upper link, then you've got your shock coming up here, which results in an entire shock tower running across here. It's pretty complex. So for the pros and cons, that's it. There's obviously a lot more to it than that, but if you're picking my brain, those are the pros and the cons that I see between the two. Again, personally myself, I like A-arm suspension better. I think as the sport evolves, we'll see more and more A-arm rear suspension on Baja Bugs. But that being said, like I tried to show in this video, there's a lot of advantages to trailing arm rear suspension. There's a lot. So I totally understand why it's predominantly trailing arm, but hopefully with some of what I've shown you here, you guys can understand why I went with A-arm rear suspension and why I think that the future will be a armed rear suspension. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope it was a little bit knowledgeable or maybe entertaining to you, and hopefully I will see you on the next video. Take care.